So we're talking about remailers, Mixmaster today. In this particular edition of FOMO, I guess we're going to spend some more time thinking about where did Bitcoin come from, and what were some of the technologies and things that were associated with the creation of Bitcoin. Lucas, you and I have been looking into this pretty extensively, and this graphic, I think, was something that came out of the Chia community, which is where we first got wind of this. This was a very innocuous kind of image and not obvious what was being talked about here. But this is the web page of one of the remailers that are associated with Mixmaster. So I think you're the one that brought this to my attention. When you first pointed it out to me, you said, hey, this is interesting, and I didn't get it at all. So let's talk about this a bit.
This is a rabbit hole like I've never been down before. So yes, I saw this flashed in a thread in a discussion about who was Satoshi leading into the HBO documentary that we started talking about earlier this week. And I believe it was last week. And that, we hear obliquely some of these, some name dropping of what was behind, what was going on in the discussion with the cypherpunks leading into the creation of Bitcoin. But I watched a video from CodeCon 11 that Len Sassaman was talking about remailers and some of the issues that they were facing.
Or DEFCON 10.
Sorry, what did I say?
CodeCon. Yeah, because these are going to be important. Like we got to suss out a few of these things because DEFCON, CodeCon, these are important conferences that are happening, and the people that are involved in all of this stuff, the friends and the interconnections between all of these people, that it's pretty apparent because they're all attending these conferences together. They all know each other very well.
And DEFCON is an older or was started earlier. CodeCon started by Bram Cohen and Len Sassaman, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, I think you're correct. CodeCon was championed by those two. Yes.
So yeah, started digging into Mixmaster, and now I don't know where to go with this story.
Okay, well, let's just start with some of the fun stuff that we found. Maybe that's a good place to start because we started down this rabbit hole, and then we'll just take everybody else down the rabbit hole that we went as we started to understand this. So we got wind of Mixmaster. This was not something that was necessarily on our radar. I didn't really know about this. I wasn't interested in anonymous remailers. This wasn't something that I was working on or anything like that. But we started looking at this and we're like, oh, this is interesting. Len Sassaman, blah, blah, blah. But then we come down here and there's this obit, right, for Disastry, right? This is, I think, one of the things that we started looking into is who's this Janis Jagars person? And let's look at this obituary. And I think it was you that pointed this out. If we're scrolling down here and we look at when did this person died, and here's this very curious date, right?
This was the moment that my world was shaken because on the page before we had seen and remarked that Mixmaster stops development in 2008. The Satoshi team was working for 18 months on the release of Bitcoin, and then I saw this an obituary on the bottom of the page, and the obituary is for someone who passed away on October 31st. And October 31st is a day that I don't think of as the day of Halloween. I think of it as the day that the Bitcoin white paper dropped. And we've had discussions about...
Right, there's the date.
There's the date.
October 31st, 2008. And you say, there's no coincidence here. This is an homage.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So because the Bitcoin, the software was released in a soft release in, I believe, February or January earlier of that year. And again, I I had been in and out of San Francisco at this time, so there had been a buzz growing about it. And people talk about the success of Bitcoin. To me, being in San Francisco on October 31st, and I was all dolled up and going out to parties, and there was an energy in that town that day that I will never forget. Um, it was as if San Francisco all of a sudden had a soccer team that won the World Cup, and that was and I merely say that because whether Bitcoin was going to succeed and become the thing that changed the world and the thing that brought so much attention 20 years into the future, nobody knew. But there were people who understood and were incredibly excited about some of the things that it had solved and what it was at the time. And for it to be announced and to be broadcast to, say, the financial district, and beyond, the financial district and beyond, and also with the backdrop of the other things that were going on at that time, it was a momentous day. And so then to see this, that this was not you know I used to wonder, like, why the paper dropped. Was it in response to the bailouts that were going on, the Lehman Brothers collapse, et cetera, all those things going on in 2008. But to see this, it just answered a couple of questions.
Because we know from looking at some of the mail, the conversations between Marty and Satoshi, that Bitcoin had been in development for years prior. So dropping the white paper on a specific day, clearly it was authored. It was done. I mean, they had this thing cooked. It wasn't like something that was dropped on a whim. Like they decided. And I say they because I firmly believe the more that I've looked into this, this is not a single person doing this. There's too many pieces of disparate technology. There's too much stuff going on here. And if you start looking at the people who were around this Mixmaster team, the people who were involved in the various different conferences, the people who were at certain tables at certain times around the right periods of time, there there's enough people that I think you could cobble together this team that could create Bitcoin. So the fact that it's in development for this period of time means that they likely had this paper authored, it was done, and then they dropped it on a specific day because they're calling back to Janis, this guy that died.
Well, and to me, I I also think that
Should we play that Janis clip? I mean, that might be a good time to just.
yes, let's play that. Cue that up. And while you're queuing it up, to me, the they is so very important. But one of the things that has been, I don't know, a missing piece in that understanding of Satoshi being a team is what bound this team together after delivery of a product. It's one thing to work together. It's another thing to remain unified after something is delivered, and they certainly did. And to see that this is an homage to somebody, I think this is what held them together. So go ahead and cue this up. This is a um, remarks, maybe at a CodeCon conference. I can't remember where. This is Nick Mathewson and giving a memorial to Janis Jagars at CodeCon 2003, which CodeCon 2003, co-chaired by Len Sassaman and Bram Cohen, was dedicated to the memory of Janis Jagars.
The cypherpunks, I'm sick of the people that call themselves cypherpunks. I'm sick of it mainly because the original tenets of the cypherpunk movement are things that I believe in very strongly. And the people that are now claiming cypherpunkism aren't doing anything. There are a few people who are the exception. One of those people went by the name Disastry. His name was Janis Jagars. disaster, he did not write any programs himself. He doesn't have a recognized name as being a crypto author. But what he did was provide considerable guidance, coding assistance, suggestions, and help to crypto and privacy-oriented application development in the community. When GPG was released and had the GNU philosophy of not including any patented algorithms, he went and wrote an IDEA plugin so that people could communicate with PGP 2.6. When the Windows privacy tray needed an installer so that Windows users could use GPG with a friendly-to-use front end, he went and wrote that. He's done a number of things like that that didn't really gain him fame, and that's not what he was looking for. He wasn't looking for recognition as the crypto Jesus Christ. He was not trying to find ways to have a voice to criticize the government just for the sake of that and make himself a martyr. Seems to be another predominant problem with the cypherpunks. There's a number of people who are friends of mine who call themselves cypherpunks who have stated that they want to die in a hail of bullets just for the sake of that.
Okay, that's the end of that clip. Sorry. You always got to remember, like, when I play a clip, I got to take a second to mess around with my audio. But that's the end of that. So we've got this dedication to Janis Jagars' Disastry as this person, and there's the connection to the white paper drop date, right?
Yep, and I thought leaving a pause, a moment there after the playing of it, just for people to absorb that. So that was a man who had a profound effect on the cypherpunks, or at least some cypherpunks, and the Mixmailer team. And
Which was championed and led by Len Sassaman. So he took that over. So what we're starting to develop here is this idea that Len is part of this small team that's going to do this or whatever, right? But I think when we start thinking about, like, how did Bitcoin actually come into play, there's certain skill sets and things that need to be present, right? And there's clues in this as to certain things that were said. And I think it'd be worthwhile to throw out this article that Evan Hatch wrote, because I think he does a pretty good job of making a case for Len being involved. So let me get that one pulled up quick.
great. And this is where, yes, this is where your inspection of the code in writing Bitcoin, and this is where I really appreciate what you bring in understanding what was going on there, and digging into the I don't know, the tone of the coders behind it. So what strikes you in this article?
So I think Evan Hatch does a pretty good job of talking this through, saying, well, there's a good case for Len being Satoshi. He's immortalized in the blockchain. He's working on the right stuff at the right time. He's around the right people, that he would be in the right place to do this. And he talks about some stuff in this article about, Hal Finney, the remailers, Mixmaster, and whatever. But the thing that really struck out to me in this was this spot where they start talking about the CompSec part, the computer security part. So they say, well, how well was this code written? Like, what was it that, from a computer security perspective, that it was different than many other things that people had experienced? And I thought it was in this one. Let me take a quick look. I thought it was here, but maybe it was in this follow-up to this post. Yeah, hold on. I think it's no, here it is. Yep. So you've got this guy, Dan Kaminsky, who is also dead. But he reviews the code that's published, and he said he couldn't find any bugs in it. Couldn't find any of these computer security bugs that I would have expected to find. And I've never seen anything like it. So this is not some fly-by-night person here. This is someone who's very prominent in computer security. And there's this connection between Kaminsky and Len Sassaman, because they were talking about how they were attacking SSL. So Kaminsky and Len and Meredith are all involved in computer security, and somehow the Bitcoin code base doesn't have any security flaws in it, or at least none of the ones that Kaminsky would have went to go find. So either there's some weird psyop going on here where they're trying to throw people off the trail of who's actually involved and Kaminsky's involved, or there's some other person who's deeply, really good at computer security that helped do all of the pen testing for the application, right? And this is one of the things that kind of stuck out to me when I first started looking into the Bitcoin code bases. I'm like, how did they run this? Like, where's all the tooling? If you think about how you would develop an application, you're slowly working on it over time. You're spending 2 years doing this, and you're going to run a series of tests. You're going to try to figure out if like it's actually working correctly. So you're not going to do all of this manually. You're not going to go through and do this with a debugger and stuff like that. You're going to have to write some test code, and you're going to have to write a bunch of things that would help you to be the harnesses around which you're developing this code and getting it correct. And as far as I could tell, a lot of that test code and a lot of that harness code didn't get published with the original version. So even if you're thinking about how would you accept a pull request, or how would you know that you could take some code that somebody says is fixing a bug, like you'd want to be able to run some tests or something, but I don't see evidences of that. Maybe I'm missing it, and I'd love it if anybody that has seen any of that stuff or was there in the early days can give us a heads up as to where we could go look for it. But when I first started looking at those early versions of Bitcoin, I didn't see it. So it seems like they either held some stuff back, or there was some other ways that they had been working on the supporting code around Bitcoin that helped them to develop it and test it and do some of the security testing around how they got this stuff right. Like I don't see how they could have got this right unless there were additional things that were held back, or there was part of the team that was working on this particularly, because it's hard to be an expert in all these different pieces of technology. The more likely thing is that there's just more people involved.
And you looked into where Len was proficient with regards to coding, and I believe he was a C programmer, but Bitcoin was written in C++.
Right. So if you look at the Mixmaster code base, this is all written in C, and the code that's there, it's not an immediate transfer. You just like writing good C code is not the same as writing good C++ code. There are nuances to any of these different languages. So when you write something in a particular language, it has ways that you want to write in it. It has the right ways to do it for that particular language. Python's got its own ways. C has its own ways. C++ has its own ways. And the C++ code is written with a particular style. And I'll bring up another person's perspective on this, because there's an individual who has recently spoke about the particulars of the C++ code to kind of give another voice to this. So here's this guy Amir talking about the C++ code, and he is remarking on it, where he says Satoshi is not a programmer, but in Satoshi's own words, he said, I'm a good coder. Like he made that assertion in the Marty emails. He says, I'm a good developer. I'm a better developer than I am, at this other stuff. So one of the people who is voicing Satoshi, who is speaking for it, who's responding to these emails, he has a way that he talks to people. Because we spent some time looking through the Marty emails, some of the other emails that were released as part of the Craig Wright trial. And one of the things that's stuck out to me in reading all of that was that he would copy and paste stuff. Like he'd get asked the same question and he'd just respond with the exact same response. So he's getting proficient and being efficient with his time about corresponding with people by, when they ask the same kind of question, he gives the exact same answer. And I think a lot of people were respecting the privacy of Satoshi and they weren't sharing it. But now that we've had the ability to look through this stuff after the Craig Wright trial, where they're debunking that Craig Wright is not Satoshi, you got to start seeing Satoshi speaking to various different people and how he's letting little pieces of information dribble out about himself. He's saying little turns of phrase, which we talked about in the last time we discussed this, where he's got these little Britishisms. And in the one article that was written by Hatch, he talks about this. He mentions how Len would speak with these Britishisms. Like I'll go back to this, and he's got all these little British turns of phrase that he uses in his discussions on Twitter, where he's saying certain things, and you see this also in the communications where Satoshi is talking to various different people, and he's got these little Britishisms, and there's this British connection on the what was burned into the Genesis block. So there's some connection on this kind of thing, and that it gives strong evidence that this idea that Len was involved. But then if you look at the kind of coding that Len was doing, he wasn't necessarily doing some of the stuff that would have been needed to have resulted in the code that was published. But Meredith being involved, and that being Len's wife, that gives a lot of credence that she might have been helping with some of the computer security part, because she is a very accomplished computer security professional. Maybe it'd be a good time to play like a little clip of Meredith talking. We could see a little bit of that.
Go ahead, cue that up. And Len's handle, we should also add, was Rabbi. So disaster and Rabbi. And I say that because I think that what Len brought was a lot of the broad vision to the team, and how Finney was experienced in cryptography. They needed a pen tester, and they needed a C++ programmer.
To defend against SQL injection with regular expression-based whitelisting or blacklisting. And this guy mentions this, and
We lost the audio. You can turn it up.
why would you try to match it with regular expressions anyway? The pigeonhole principle says that's always going to be able to be tricked. Wouldn't you just come up with some way to do context-free whitelisting? And the guy's like, what would that even look like? And I'm like, I can see it. I guess I'll just have to go write the code. So I did. And then when I told Len about it, he realized that there was potential here for far more than just SQL. So I ended up giving a talk about that particular project called Dejector at Black Hat in 2005. And then
Okay, so there's that piece. Let me play one more clip, because I got one other one queued up where it's kind of driving this point home. So give me 1 second. I'll get that up.
regular expression whitelisting or blacklisting. So they'll try to come up with some complicated regular expression or some set of regular expressions that accurately describes inputs that we want to kick out, or you want to do the same thing and just try to describe the set of inputs that you're willing to accept. Now, the problem with doing this for SQL is that SQL is not a regular language. If you try to use a regular expression, a deterministic finite automata, to validate a context-free language, this is always going to fail. The pigeonhole principle says
That's kind of that point. Meredith and Len, married, they're together, they're working on stuff, compsec things, very common. They definitely have this skill set to be able to produce code that is free from these known vulnerabilities. They're going to DEF CON, Black Hat. They are steeped, they are well knowledged in these areas, right? Like this I think is something that we can say, if they're both on the team, then they would be bringing this expertise to bear into the Bitcoin code base.
So let's maybe turn it back to Mixmailer and Senshi. Is it, or was there other aspects of the team that we wanted to talk about or that you had?
Well, I think we want to play one more short clip where Len is talking about Mixmaster and what are the problems that needed to be solved. And I think that this one's really important because there's been this discussion that what Bitcoin was intended to be doing was taking reusable proofs of work and solving the spam problem on remailer systems. And I think that this is a really important point to maybe dispel that that's what was intended here. I don't think that this is what was being worked on. I think it's something else. So let's just show that quick and then we'll go back to the remailer thing because I think it cues it up. So give me 1 second to get this pulled up.
Okay, sounds good.
We have a question in the front.
Do you have any problems with spam?
Thank you. Okay. I have given remailer talks, probably 4 or 5, maybe 6 times now, and every time I turn questions over to the audience, the first abuse question is a spam question. It's not about death threats. It's not about kiddie porn trafficking. It's not about all these other abuse things that really don't happen. It's about spam. Apparently, spam is the most egregious thing that anyone can do on the internet with remailers, and I like that, because if that's the worst thing you can do, then we're pretty well off. But
no, we're not having problems with spam. Thankfully, we're not.
No, we're not.
Well,
and we won't ever have problems with spam.
Yeah, there's problems with Usenet spam certainly coming through, and Usenet trolls. But the way Mixmaster works, you don't or the way remailers in general work, you're not going to get a bunch of messages sent out through the system. It'll be somewhat rate limited by virtue of being somewhat slow and there being easier ways to send spam. And it's only really worthwhile if you're sending it to a mailing list or to to some sort of multi-person distribution system like a Usenet forum.
Okay, so this is the panel at DEF CON 11 where we've got people that are talking about Mixmaster, talking about the remailer, and they're saying spam's not a problem. And if you watch this entire video, which we'll have this all in the notes for the show, so if you want to go watch all of these, you'll be able to get more in depth on this. But essentially, what they say is we don't need more nodes in the remailer system. Like 20 is pretty good, and if you got up to 50, it's actually going to cause a problem for privacy. And they're talking about the ways that you want to set up obfuscation and privacy within the remailer. And I think in our discussion, I likened it to like a school of fish, right? If you have a school of fish and you have a whole bunch of fish and they're all equal size and they're all swimming in very similar way, and it's darting this way and that, it's really hard to pick out one fish and say, that's that fish, that's the one that we want to get. But if there was one fish and it was big and it swam off in a different direction, it loses the privacy of the swarm. So in this remailer talk, what they're talking about is they're talking about padding bytes and making all the bytes look consistent. And they're talking about making all the messages look as consistent as possible and saying, if you're spamming the network, you actually lose the thing that you would try to gain from being on the remailer, because you're going to stick out like a sore thumb because other people aren't doing that. So if you want to be private, if you want to preserve your anonymity in a remailer system, you have to look like everybody else. And spam doesn't look like everybody else because they're not doing that. So unless there's a ubiquitous problem of spam is constant in the system, then spam isn't a problem. So this idea that reusable proofs of works are a solution to spam in remailers seems to be disingenuous. It doesn't seem like it was the problem that was trying to be solved. And if you look at Len's reaction, he throws his hands up and he's got all this body language. He's like, this is the question that I get asked. Like, I can't even believe it. Like, of all the things that we could possibly get asked, and this is the question we get asked, is spam. So I think that dispels the idea that, Bitcoin's origins were in somehow using proof of work to fix spam, because remailers and privacy is what was being worked on and that somehow this was the solution that they were reaching for because they needed it.
And when you say padding bits, because they're talking about trying to anonymize mail when they're talking about these remailers.
Well, yeah. What I mean by padding is, let's say that you have a message and one is 100 characters long, and then you have another one is 13 characters long. If you wanted to make it so that all things look equal, then you would take that 13 character one and maybe make it 500 characters, and you would take the 100 characters and you would make that 500 characters. So everything looks like 500 characters, and you would do it in such a way that you couldn't distinguish short messages from larger messages. So you're doing all of this stuff to make that school of fish. Like that's what you're trying to do, is you're trying to make all the fish look exactly equal so that nothing is differentiable within the messages that get sent. You want to try to do that so you can hide in the noise, so you can hide in the swarm.
And maybe for a metaphor to what that might turn into, if you're trying to anonymize bushels of grain or a Kandinsky painting, you might pad them into something like coins. Coins are anonymous; they are identical. So,
well, I think there's some origins in those ideas, right? Of like, but remember that in Bitcoin we didn't have coins. Like we're in the world of Chia, so coin is natural for us to think about. But they thought about transactions and unspent transaction outputs. They had these pretty, like different ideas about how they would do it, and the terminology that was used.
Okay, well, I'm just trying to understand the leap from an anonymizing mail server to Bitcoin, a notion of an electronic cash system.
Well, there are mechanisms in what they're doing with Mixmaster that I think overlap. So if you look at, and maybe this is a good time to bring this one up, we mentioned CodeCon and we mentioned DEF CON, but if you look at who were some of the people who were involved in the group, right? Like who is Len close to? Who is he collaborating with? I think some of the CodeCon attendees or people that were organizing this stuff is a good place to look for who might be a part of that group, because I think CodeCon really was their small cadre of people that they were bringing together. So you see here, if we're looking at CodeCon 2009, so this was after the white paper dropped. Bram is part of it. We've got Len, who's a part of it. We got Meredith, who's a part of it. And then you have this other guy, Roger Dingledine. And Roger Dingledine was working on remailers too. So the technology for Tor, I believe, started with this whole idea of doing anonymous remailers, because mail was the first idea for how people were exchanging messages. But then they started to think about, well, what if you want to do it in more real time? What if you want to do something where you can't absorb these latencies? And this is where the ideas around how you would build Tor, and Tor was integrated into Bitcoin pretty early. I don't know if it was exactly on first launch, but like it was integrated as like another piece of technology. So if you look at, well, what did you have to be good at? Well, you had to know Tor, you had to know anonymous remailer style technology, you had to know cryptography, you had to know CompSec. I mean, it just looks like this is a list of people that you would have to know. And unfortunately, almost all these people are dead. Like a lot of them are dead. Not all the ones in this list, but a lot of the people who you might think that would have been involved in the team that could have created Bitcoin, like a lot of them are no longer living. Like very early collaborators to this stuff are not here anymore.
Well, let's not get to that too quickly. So let's talk about nodes, because in that panel, it was sort of my takeaway that when they mention or they have a discussion later on in that panel about the number of nodes of remailers that exist, I believe they said there were only 30 or somewhere around 30 nodes for the Mixmaster remailer were operating. it seemed to me like they might be looking uh, for a way to improve the number of nodes that were being that were hosting the service. But you had a different takeaway from that.
Well, because Len says, no, we don't want that. Yeah, that question comes up because it said, well, how many are you trying to get? And how many people do you want? He actually said that if there were a lot of people running remailers, that it would affect the privacy of the system because now you would have too few users on nodes. And so you could start to do analysis of traffic patterns to say, well, what node are they entering on, or what node are they routing traffic through? So he said 50 is actually too big given the amount of traffic that is on the remailer system. He said, 20 to 30 is actually fine. What they actually wanted was more people using the remailer system so that there was more of the school of fish to hide within. So the school of fish analogy holds because it's like the traffic that's being sent, but also the nodes that are being used to send the messages. So you kind of need both. You need stuff to hide within, and then you need the nodes to actually operate the network so that you can hide your messages inside of it. So I think he said you should be sending more messages through this if you care about this, even if it's mundane stuff like regular stuff, just like use it, because then there's noise to hide inside of. Yeah, so he dispels this myth, or he dispels this idea that we want lots and lots and lots of remailers. He said, we don't really need that. That's not what's important, but use the system. Like that's what we need. We need more people sending messages through it, so there's noise to hide inside of.
And when you brought that up and that understanding of the nuance in the conversation, it gave me an aha to the intent behind the design of Bitcoin, because you know that I constantly beat the dead horse of Bitcoin. If it was more democratic, or I would like to see more nodes in Bitcoin, but obviously they were thinking about the requirements of anonymity and onion routing, and how they were going to keep a lot of fish in the pool to maintain that anonymity. But then I think about some of the innovations that Bram brought forth in Chia, and moving away from proof of work to proof of space and time, or to proof in time, and it certainly, I mean, he calls it Bitcoin 2.0, but I begin to understand why it was necessary for Bitcoin 1.0 to rely on proof of work.
And I think that this is one that we talked about before, and I think we got to say it again. Bram has repeatedly said that he was not part of this team. He was not apprised of this. Satoshi didn't tell him who he was. He thanked him for not saying that. Bram also famously got into the Bitcoin community and started asking a bunch of questions, tried to get educated on how Bitcoin worked, and started to say that there were things that could have been done better. I mean, that's sort of his entry into the world of blockchain technology, is he's getting up to speed on Bitcoin and starting to say, I would have done things differently. I think that there were things that could have been improved on. And I think that reaction wasn't some kind of psyop. I think it was because Bram was working on something else at the time. He was working at BitTorrent Incorporated. That's what he was doing in 2009. So when these guys were working on this stuff, he was off enjoying the successes of BitTorrent, was helping to try to make that company be a success, and was working on these things at the time, and then comes around to Bitcoin probably right after Len passes away, after Len kills himself. This is
Well,
this is when he starts to look into it.
and I don't know. It seems to me that there's also a couple of people with expertise that they were well acquainted with for the solving of some of these problems in the creation of Bitcoin. So um, I don't know who else it could be, but I do think both with Senshi and some of I think we need to also talk about Ulf Muller. But first, what do we want to say about Senshi?
Well, as far as Senshi, this was the graphic that we put at the beginning. This was one of the things that first tipped us off. I at least wanted to throw it on the screen to say, like, where did that graphic come from? So Senshi is one of the remailers associated with Mixmaster. So Mixmaster has a bunch of nodes. Senshi is one of the nodes. And one of the things that's being brought up about, well, why is Senshi particularly important? Because Senshi's remailer has an email address associated with it that is very close to the email address that was used by Satoshi. So there's this Senshi, Satoshi, this GMX, email address. Which let me pull that up, and that's the idea that there is a connection here that you can't easily dismiss this without trying to understand how could this have come into play, right? So I think it's here. If you look at Senshi's email, this one right here, that is very close to the email address that was used by Satoshi.
Gotcha. He was using a GMX dot. Is that DE? Deutschland or the Netherlands? What is DE?
I think DE is DE Denmark?
Maybe. It could be. Well, and bear in mind that Len is also at a university in the Netherlands at this time. Maybe he's living in Belgium or Benelux.
I think it might be Germany.
Germany, yeah. Deutschland. Well, that's an interesting connection because there was another member of the team, Ulf Muller, and I think we need to also include him in the discussion. He was murdered in Germany in 2012, and that causes the hair on the back of my neck to stand up because it could have been a coincidence, but it could have been somebody who put some of this together and was trying to extract information from him.
Well, just to finish that thought on the email connection, this is the connection that's being made. It's this GMX thing. So what is this? Where did I have that? So see, it's this gmx.de. So here's the reason why this connection is being drawn. Is here's Senshi remailer gmx.de, and here you've got Satoshi using this gmx.com email address. All right, let me pull up the Ulf Muller thing. Okay, I've got that up. So was there a particular spot that you want me to scroll to, or one that says more succinctly what's going on here?
Well, if we also maybe bounce back to the Mixmaster SourceForge page too, at the bottom of it there is another tribute to Ulf Muller, and it says, in January 2012 we lost Ulf Muller, our friend and main advisor. So and this one is just the timing. This is after the release of Bitcoin, a couple of years after the release of Bitcoin, as it becomes known, as it begins to be used for illicit transactions. And when I think about the timing of this and the details of his abduction, I have to wonder if somebody who was familiar with familiar with criminal activity and became familiar with the Bitcoin, thought that they might be able to get access to a wallet that the team had set aside. So I don't know. Read this and take it for what you will, but this was another member of the Mixmaster team.
Well, to sum up, I think we're still learning more about this, kind of getting some understanding of who were the players that were around Len at the time. I feel very convinced that Len Sassaman was involved in Bitcoin at the very early days. I think there were other people that were part of the team. I I look at some of the body language in the HBO documentary of Adam Back. I don't know this person well, but some of the body language just kind of struck me as like he seemed nervous. He seemed like he didn't want to talk about certain things. And when asked about certain aspects of the code and the ways that he reacted to Bitcoin, he had a pretty positive take on it, that it had come from people who were very well versed in the sort of stuff that was needed. And I don't believe in this whole lone wolf idea that's being put out there, that you've got somebody that just kind of comes on the scene out of nowhere. It seems like there was a scene that was the genesis of Bitcoin. I think Evan Hatch does a pretty good job of developing this idea, and it was furthered in another article that we'll link, that I think reading kind of both of those together does a pretty good job of it. But I think that their idea that it was Len by himself and Len was Satoshi, I think that there's probably more nuance to it, because Len had close collaborators that he is working with. He had a team of friends that were very close to him, and they just so happened to have a lot of the skills that were needed to be able to make this happen. And I think that when you have a code base that's as nuanced and as well developed as what Bitcoin was, even with whatever flaws people started to find when they first ran it, um, there was the necessary skill set amongst the people that were around Len, if he collaborated with them, and they were all able to keep a secret. And I think that they were in the business of being private, being anonymous, and this was their regular operating procedure from like what they were doing. So I think if anybody was going to be able to keep these kinds of things up for a period of time, it would have been this group. And I think that this idea that Hal was involved early, I think Hal dispenses that. There was the last message that Hal sent, when he's suffering from Lou Gehrig's disease, he's no longer able to really function in the world. And it's his last message to the Bitcoin community. And in that message, he says, I wasn't involved in the early formation of Bitcoin. Like, he pretty much says, I wasn't part of the team. So this idea that Hal did the coding of Bitcoin, I don't think that holds either. I think Hal was more involved in C coding, and he wasn't as involved in C++. So there's still this missing, who's the C++ coder that's doing a lot of the legwork on this. I don't know that we know the answer to that one just yet. But I'll throw this message from Hal on here real quick as maybe the wrap for this show. And I don't know how much time we're going to spend on this in the future. What do you think, Lucas? How much more of this are we really going to spend time on this? I don't think this is going to be the focus of the show from now on.
I thought we were going to do one show on it, but there was so much information, and 40 minutes has already rolled by 10 minutes ago today. So if we learn more, we'll do another show about it. But I don't want to dwell on it. It's been an interesting dig. It was kind. I mean, seeing the date of Janis Jagars' death and tying that to the publication of the Bitcoin white paper answered a lot of questions for me. and mainly about how a team, what inspired a team to dedicate themselves to work so selflessly towards this goal, and then also to remain unified in not spilling the beans afterwards. So that's what really caught my attention, and the reason I thought we would spend another day on this. But things are happening in the world today, and we'll probably pick up there next week. So enjoyed it, and pull up that Hal, pull up that tweet from Hal. Is it a tweet or an email?
Oh, hold on. I didn't even realize I hadn't pulled it up yet, but here it is. I actually got it right there. So here's the last communication that Hal Finney did to the Bitcoin mailing list. So it's Hal Finney's last message. I don't think he wrote any more after this, but here's where he specifically says Satoshi's true identity and who he thought he was. And I think that this dispels that Hal was working on Bitcoin. He says, this is how I came to it. I learned about it. I got involved in it, but it was after the fact.
You know, there's one other thing I guess I want to add that we haven't discussed in this, and that is the ghost in the shell. And I mentioned it to you at some point, but there was one of the greatest anime movies that has ever been created. Probably the genesis of a lot of ideas that were later in the live action Matrix with Neo, and it was called The Ghost in the Shell. In The Ghost in the Shell, there is a character who is the Laughing Man, and he infects the world. The Laughing Man infects the world with an idea, and that idea like lives beyond him. So I also see echoes of the Laughing Man through Satoshi, and I can see a team who was who shared the experience of watching that movie and carrying those ideas forward. So if viewers haven't seen Ghost in the Shell, I highly recommend it. It might also put them in a time to in a place to understand some of the positioning and the sharing of these ideas.
All right. Well, it's been a fun dive. This is a lot of stuff that I'd never really been that exposed to. I got to watch a lot of cool clips from the early 2000s and into the late 2000s of people talking about tech that clearly has influenced our lives. I can't wait to see Evan Hatch's documentary on the early days of Bitcoin. I think he's going to do a fantastic job of it. I think that one's going to be one that everyone's going to look at and say he did a much better job of trying to establish the origins of Bitcoin, because I think he's on the right track. Honestly, the more I look at it, I'd love to speak with him. If Evan wants to come on the show, if you ever hear from people saying, wow, we kind of dissected this a bit, and like, love to talk to you if you've got the impetus to come kind of talk this through before you drop your documentary, or maybe go talk to Cancel Coco about it. Like, somebody's got to pick this up in a little bit more substantive way, because I think he's really on the right track, and he's got something as far as what he's putting together, and it resonates with some of the stuff that our Chia community has been speaking about as well. So from Julius to Slowest Timler to various people that have pointed out things in the past that have happened as to what are the likely true origins of Bitcoin. It likely comes from these groups, these people who were all kind of working together, working on a lot of stuff, that were very tight-knit, close community, knew each other well, and some subset of them likely came together and worked on Bitcoin and birthed it into the world.
All right, see you next week.